People in the pack used to say Raoul Logan was carved out of the mountain itself, not born like the rest of us. They said it with a kind of awe that bordered on fear, the way you talk about weather that could kill you if you weren't careful. I used to believe it too before I knew him. Before I knew that the mountain has rivers running through it, deep underground, where nobody can see them, but they never stop moving. I should start at the beginning because if I don't, none of this will make sense. Not the way his hand felt around mine in front of 300 witnesses. Not the way the whole courtyard went silent, like the world had forgotten how to breathe. I was 23 when I first saw him, standing at the edge of the training grounds with his arms crossed, watching a sparring match he wasn't part of. He never sparred. He never raised his voice, never raised a hand. People assumed this meant he was soft. Until they remembered what he'd done to the rogue pack that tried to take our territory 3 winters before I arrived. How he'd ended 11 trained fighters without a single mark on himself, then walked away without looking back. That was the contradiction that defined him. A man capable of devastating violence who flinched, almost imperceptibly, if anyone got too close. I noticed it the first week I lived among the Logan pack, brought in as an Omega from a smaller, struggling pack that had merged with his for protection. I noticed how he greeted people with a nod instead of a handshake, how he stood at the back of every gathering instead of the center, how even his own betas kept a careful, respectful distance. Like there was an invisible line drawn around him that nobody dared to cross. Nobody except me, eventually. That came much later, and slowly, the way trust always does when it's worth anything at all. My name is Andre Clerk, and before I tell you about the hand-holding, the moment that had elders whispering for weeks, I need to tell you about the loneliness that came before it, both his and mine. I grew up the youngest of 4 in a pack that didn't have much to spare. We loved each other fiercely, the way poor families often do, filling the gaps where resources failed with stubborn devotion. But when our pack's territory was threatened by a hostile takeover, the alphas made the only sensible decision: merge with a larger, stronger pack for survival. That pack was the Logans. That alpha was Raoul. I remember the first pack meeting after the merge. All of us new Omegas and Betas standing in a loose, nervous cluster, while the established Logan members studied us like a problem they hadn't agreed to solve. Raoul stood at the front, addressing the gathered crowd with a calm voice that carried without needing volume. He welcomed us, promised protection, a place among them. Not beneath them, he was careful to say. Among them. It was a good speech. It would have been a comforting one, if not for the strange chill that came from watching a man speak so warmly about belonging while standing as far from everyone as the room allowed. I didn't think about him again for months after that. I was busy adjusting, learning the new pack's rhythms, finding my footing in unfamiliar territory, making a few cautious friends among the other young Omegas. Raoul existed at the edges of my awareness, the way a mountain exists at the edges of a valley town, always visible, rarely thought about directly, simply theirs, holding up the sky. The first time I really saw him as a person and not a landmark, was an accident, the kind that changes the shape of your life without asking permission first. It was late autumn, the air sharp enough to sting, and I'd stayed behind after a hunting lesson to practice tracking on my own, embarrassed by how far behind the other Omegas I'd fallen. I wasn't paying attention to where the trail led. I wasn't paying attention to the drop in elevation, or the loose shale, or the way the ground gave out beneath my left foot until I was sliding down an incline with nothing to grab and a very clear, very cold understanding that I was about to hit the ravine floor wrong. I didn't hit the ravine floor at all. One moment I was falling certain of pain, and the next I was caught. An arm like a steel beam wrapped around my middle. My back pressed flush against a chest that didn't so much as stagger under the sudden weight of me. It happened so fast that my brain hadn't caught up to my body yet, and for several long seconds I just hung there, suspended, my heart slamming against my ribs while I tried to understand that I wasn't falling anymore. "You're all right," he said, and the voice was low and rough like it didn't get used often enough to wear smooth. "I've got you. Breathe." I twisted to look up, and found myself staring into the face of Raoul Logan from a distance of perhaps 6 inches, close enough to see that his eyes weren't simply dark the way I'd always assumed from afar, but a deep, warm brown with flecks of amber near the center like sunlight trapped in tree bark, close enough to see that he was holding his breath too. He set me down with a care that seemed almost exaggerated, like he was handling something breakable, and the instant my feet touched solid ground, he stepped back. Not casually, not gradually, but with the swift, complete retreat of someone putting distance between himself and a flame. His hands, which had just saved my life, curled into loose fists at his sides like he didn't know what else to do with them. "Thank you," I managed, still breathless, still shaking slightly from the adrenaline. "I didn't even hear you." "You should be more careful with the shale on that ridge," he said, cutting through my gratitude like it embarrassed him to receive it. "It's unstable this time of year. The rain loosens it." "Right, I'll remember that." I studied him for a moment. This man who'd just crossed a ravine's width in less time than it took me to fall, who'd caught me without bruising me, who was now looking at a point somewhere over my left shoulder rather than at my face. "Were you following me?" "I was checking the southern perimeter." A pause, brief but noticeable. "I heard you fall." I wanted to ask more. How he'd moved so fast. Why he was patrolling the perimeter alone when he had betas for that. Why a man who'd just demonstrated such effortless, total control over his own strength looked so deeply uncomfortable standing 3 feet away from someone he'd helped. But something in his posture told me the conversation was already over as far as he was concerned. He gave a short nod. The same nod he gave everyone, the one that functioned as both greeting and dismissal, and turned to walk back up the ridge. "Wait," I called after him, surprising myself. "I don't even know. I mean, thank you. Really." He paused without turning around. The wind picked up between us, carrying the scent of pine and the coming winter, and for a moment I thought he might say something else. Something that would explain the strange tightness in his shoulders or the careful distance in his voice. Instead, he simply said, "Get home before dark," and continued up the trail, leaving me standing in the ravine with my pulse still racing and a question I wouldn't find the answer to for almost a year. That question was simple, even if the answer turned out to be anything but. Why did the strongest, most controlled alpha in 3 territories look like touching another living person might be the most dangerous thing he'd ever done? I didn't see him again for weeks after that, not up close anyway. I caught glimpses of him during pack gatherings, at the edge of the dining hall during communal meals, at the back of meetings where decisions were made about hunting grounds and territory disputes. He had a way of being present and absent at the same time, contributing exactly what was necessary and nothing more, like he was rationing himself. I asked about him eventually, carefully, the way you ask about anyone whose reputation precedes them into every room. I asked Senna, one of the betas who'd grown up in the Logan pack and had known Raoul since they were children running wild through these same woods. "He wasn't always like this," she told me one evening, the two of us sitting on the back steps of the communal hall while the sky turned the color of a healing bruise. "When we were kids, he used to be the one piling on top of everyone during games, dragging us all into the lake, the whole loud, tangled mess of it. He had this laugh that used to embarrass his mother. It was so big." "What happened?" Senna's expression shifted, the easy warmth of nostalgia giving way to something more careful. "That's not really my story to tell," she said. "But I'll say this much. Losing people changes how you let yourself love the ones who are still here. Some people grieve loud. Raoul grieved by closing every door he had left open." I didn't push further, even though I wanted to. There was something in the way she said it, us closing every doors, that made the careful distance Raoul kept from everyone suddenly look less like coldness and more like armor. The deliberate architecture of a man protecting himself from a wound that had never properly healed. I thought about that conversation more than I probably should have. I thought about it during meals when I watched him decline, with quiet but absolute finality, anyone who tried to clap him on the shoulder. I thought about it when I noticed how he always positioned himself near exits, near open spaces, anywhere that gave him room to step back if someone got too close. I thought about it especially during the pack's harvest festival, when the whole community danced and embraced with the easy physical affection that defined us. Wolves are tactile creatures, built for closeness, and Raoul stood at the very edge of it all, watching with an expression I could only describe as hunger wearing the mask of indifference. He wanted it. That was the thing I couldn't stop noticing. He wanted the closeness everyone else took for granted, and he denied himself every single time it came near, like a man standing at the edge of warm water watching everyone else swim, convinced that if he stepped in, he'd drown someone else trying to keep himself afloat. I didn't fall in love with him then. I want to be honest about that, because so many stories like this pretend the falling happens instantly, in one cinematic moment, and that was never true for us. What happened instead was slower and stranger. I became curious about him in a way that didn't fade, a quiet fascination with the puzzle of a man who clearly contained more warmth than he let himself spend. It would be another 4 months before I understood why. The understanding came, as most important things did with Raoul, sideways and unannounced. Winter had settled fully over the territory by the time it happened, the kind of cold that made the pines crack at night and turned the river to slow, dark glass. I'd been assigned to the Eastern Watch rotation, a duty that mostly involved long, quiet hours, scanning empty tree lines for threats that rarely came. And I'd taken to bringing a book to pass the time. Tucked into the pocket of my coat alongside cold hands and colder thoughts, I found him by accident again. It seemed to be the only way I ever found him. Sitting alone at the old stone marker that divided Logan territory from the unclaimed land beyond it. He wasn't on duty. I checked the rotation later and confirmed it. He was simply there, sitting with his back against weathered stone, staring out at nothing in particular, and something about the stillness of him, the totality of his solitude, made me stop instead of walking past. "You're not on the schedule," I said, instead of anything gentler. He didn't startle, though I knew he must not have heard me approach across the snow. Or maybe he had, and simply hadn't reacted, the way he never seemed to react to anything as plainly as other people did. "It's the anniversary," he said, which explained nothing and everything at once, the way grief often speaks in code. Only the griever fully understands. I should have left him alone. Every instinct I had about boundaries told me to nod and walk on, to respect the closed door Senna had warned me about months earlier. Instead, I sat down beside him, a careful 2 feet of distance between us, close enough to share the conversation but far enough to respect whatever invisible perimeter he kept around himself. "Anniversary of what?" For a long moment I thought he wouldn't answer. The silence stretched out, filled only by wind moving through bare branches and the distant call of something hunting in the dark. When he finally spoke, his voice had a different quality than I'd heard from him before, not the careful, measured tone he used for pack business, but something rawer, like a wound that had never quite closed over. "My brother," he said, "and the rest of them, 11 years ago today." I waited, not pushing, learning already that Raoul gave information the way a held breath gives air, slowly, and only when the pressure became too much to bear otherwise. "There was an attack," he continued, eyes still fixed on the dark tree line. "A rival pack, before the Logans held this much territory. My father wasn't strong enough yet to defend everything we had, and they knew it. They came at night, while most of the pack was asleep in the lower dens." His jaw tightened, the only outward sign of the effort the words were costing him. "I was 18. Already stronger than most adults in the pack, faster, the kind of alpha that gets talked about before he's even proven himself. My father woke me first because he knew what I could do. He told me to get my brother and run for the ridge, that he'd hold the den entrance until we were clear." He stopped there, and I understood, with a sinking, sympathetic dread, exactly where this story was going before he said another word. "I grabbed Thomas. That was my brother. He was 12, and I ran. I was fast enough. I was strong enough to carry him the whole way without slowing down. But somewhere in the dark, fighting through bodies that wanted us both dead, I miscalculated. I don't even remember doing it. I remember running and fighting and running again, and somewhere in all of that, in trying to protect him, his hands resting on his knees, curled slowly into fists. I held him too hard, across the chest, where I had my arm wrapped around him to keep him moving. I didn't feel it happen. I didn't know until we reached the ridge and he wasn't breathing right anymore, and by the time I got him to the healers, it was already. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I sat there in the snow beside a man who had spent 11 years believing his own strength had killed his little brother, who had clearly relived that single instant of contact thousands of times since, turning it over and over until the lesson it taught him had calcified into something permanent. That his hands, however gentle his intentions, were not safe. That love, filtered through his body, became a kind of danger he could never fully control. That wasn't your fault, I said, because it was true, and because someone needed to say it to him plainly, without hedging. You don't know that. His voice was quiet but absolute, the voice of a verdict already rendered and appealed 1,000 times without success. I don't know my own strength sometimes, even now. I know what I'm capable of when I'm not careful. I watched what happened when I wasn't careful enough, even for half a second, even when I loved him more than anything in the world. So, I learned. I learned to keep that half second from ever happening again with anyone, by never touching anyone at all. By never touching anyone at all, he confirmed, and there was no self-pity in it, only the flat, practiced certainty of a man who had made peace with a sacrifice he believed was necessary. It's a small price. I still have the pack. I still have a life. I just don't. He paused, searching for words that clearly didn't come easily. I don't let myself have what could break if I'm not perfect every single time. And nobody's perfect every single time. Eventually, I'd slip again. I'd rather slip never than slip once. I didn't know what to say to that. There wasn't a clean response to offer a man who had organized 11 years of his life around the absence of something most people considered as essential as breathing. So I did the only thing that felt honest. In that moment, I reached over slowly enough that he could pull away if he wanted to, and I rested my hand lightly against his forearm, over the fabric of his coat, making sure my touch stayed soft and brief, and entirely his to end. He went rigid. I felt it under my palm, the sudden tension of every muscle locking at once, like my touch had triggered some deep, automatic alarm he couldn't override even when he wanted to. But he didn't pull away. He sat there, breathing carefully, deliberately, while I kept my hand still and light against his arm, and after a long moment something in his shoulders loosened, just slightly, like a held breath finally allowed to escape. Nobody's touched me like that in 11 years, he said, so quietly I almost missed it beneath the wind. Not since the healers, after. Not since they told me there was nothing more they could do. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it with my whole chest. Don't be. He looked at me then, really looked, and something in his expression had shifted, some careful wall lowered just enough to let a little light through. I think I needed someone to be careless enough to try. I removed my hand a moment later, not because I wanted to, but because I understood instinctively that pushing further, asking for more than this single fragile offering, would undo whatever small progress had just been made. We sat in the snow a while longer talking about smaller things. The harvest, the upcoming winter solstice gathering, the absurd story of how Senna had once tried to teach herself to fish and ended up needing rescue from the very river she was fishing in. And by the time I finally stood to head back to the lower dens, something between us had changed shape entirely. It wasn't love yet. I want to be careful about that, because the truth matters more than the romance of a tidy narrative. What had changed was smaller and, in its own way, more significant. I had become someone Raoul Logan trusted enough to let see him, just once, without the careful armor he wore for everyone else. And he had become, to me, no longer a mountain at the edge of the valley, distant and theoretical, but a person, wounded, careful, and aching for something he didn't believe he deserved to have. That distinction mattered more than anything else that followed. After that night at the stone marker, Something shifted between us that neither of us named directly, but both of us seemed to understand. Raoul began appearing, with increasing and almost comical frequency, in places where my duties took me. He claimed coincidence the first few times. The Eastern Watch needed checking. The trail near the training grounds needed clearing of fallen branches. The granary happened to require inventory on exactly the evenings I was assigned kitchen duty. I let him keep the fiction for a while, because I understood it was easier for him to manufacture reasons than to simply admit he wanted to see me. By midwinter, he stopped manufacturing reasons altogether. "I wanted to see you," he told me one evening, arriving at the edge of the dining hall, just as I was leaving snow caught in his dark hair. His expression carrying the particular awkwardness of a man unused to stating his own desires plainly. "That's all. I don't have a task that requires it." "Good," I said, and the smile that broke across my face apparently surprised him as much as it surprised me. I was getting tired of pretending the granary needed inventory 4 times a week. We started walking together after that, not always talking, sometimes simply existing in companionable quiet along the perimeter trails while the pack's daily rhythms moved around us. I learned things about him slowly. The way you learn a language, by immersion rather than study. Not through any single conversation, but through the accumulation of small moments. I learned he loved the particular silence of the forest just before snowfall, the heavy, expectant hush that settled over everything. I learned he'd taught himself to read by candlelight as a child because he couldn't sleep most nights, and that he still kept that habit, still preferred reading to rest even now. I learned that beneath the quiet, controlled exterior, the rest of the pack saw there was a dry, unexpected wit that came out only when he felt safe enough to risk it. Usually directed at himself with a self-deprecation that made my chest ache every time. I learned, too, the precise architecture of his caution. He never touched me, not even casually, not even when every instinct in both of us seemed to strain toward closing the distance between our shoulders as we walked. He kept a careful, consistent foot of space, like a man pacing out a boundary he'd drawn for his own protection and refused to let himself cross, regardless of how much he might have wanted to. It was a kind of courtship I'd never experienced and never expected, built entirely out of words and presence and the quiet accumulating proof of choosing each other day after day, without a single physical gesture to mark the growing intimacy between us. I won't pretend it wasn't difficult. I was an omega, and even setting aside biology, I simply wanted to be close to him, wanted the casual affection that came naturally to everyone else in the pack. There were nights I went to sleep, frustrated, aching with a longing that had nowhere to go, wondering if this was simply how things would always be between us, close in every way except the one way my body kept insisting mattered. But I never pushed. I understood, even when it cost me, that pushing would only confirm Raoul's deepest fear, that closeness, demanded too quickly, could shatter something fragile beyond repair. So I waited. I let him set the pace, let him find his own way toward the parts of intimacy he'd spent 11 years convinced he had to deny himself, and I told myself that whatever we were building, slowly, carefully, brick by unhurried brick, would be worth more in the end than anything rushed could have been. The spring thaw came, and with it, the first real test of everything we'd built. There was a fever moving through the lower dens that season. Nothing catastrophic, but serious enough that the healers asked for extra hands tending the sick, and I volunteered without hesitation. The way you do when your pack needs you, and you finally found a place that feels like it's truly yours to protect. I caught the fever myself on the 4th day. The kind of illness that flattens you entirely, leaves you shivering and disoriented and barely able to stand. Raoul came to the healing den that first night, and I remember, even through the haze of fever, the particular quality of his stillness in the doorway, the way he stood frozen for a long moment before stepping inside. "You shouldn't be here," I managed, my voice rough and thin. "It's contagious." "I know." He pulled a stool close to the cot where I lay, close enough that I could see the tight, controlled worry etched into every line of his face. "I don't care." I drifted in and out that night, fever pulling me under in waves, and each time I surfaced he was still there, sitting in that same careful stillness, watching me with an intensity that should have felt invasive and instead felt like being held without being touched at all. Sometime near dawn, in the worst part of the fever, I remember reaching out blindly, my hand finding his where it rested on his knee, and gripping it with whatever strength the illness had left me. He didn't pull away. I don't remember much else from that night with any clarity, but I remember that, the warm, solid weight of his hand wrapped carefully around mine, his thumb moving in small, hesitant circles against my knuckles, like he was relearning a language he'd forgotten he ever knew how to speak. When the fever finally broke 2 days later and I woke clear-headed for the first time since falling ill, he was still there, hands still loosely curled around mine, asleep sitting upright in a chair clearly never built for comfort. "You stayed," I said, my voice cracking from disuse. He startled awake, and for one unguarded moment before he could compose himself, I saw something in his face I'd never seen there before. Relief so total it looked almost like grief. The particular expression of a man who had spent 3 days genuinely afraid he might lose someone and was only now allowing himself to believe he hadn't. "You scared me," he said, which from anyone else might have sounded like an accusation, but from Raoul, stripped raw by exhaustion and fear, sounded like the truest thing he'd ever told me. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Just." He looked down at our still joined hands like he was seeing them for the first time, and I watched him make a decision, visibly, the way you'd watch someone step off a ledge they'd been standing on for years. "Just don't do that again. I don't think I could survive losing someone else He stopped himself before finishing the sentence, but he didn't need to finish it. I'd heard the shape of the word he hadn't let himself say, and something in my chest cracked open with a tenderness so fierce it nearly hurt. "Raoul," I said softly, "you can say it." He was quiet for a long moment, his thumb still moving against my knuckles in that same careful, exploratory rhythm, like he was memorizing the sensation against the possibility he might never let himself have it again. "I love you," he said finally, the words coming out rough and unpracticed, like a confession dragged up from somewhere very deep. "I think I have for a while now. I just didn't know how to say it without." He gestured vaguely between us, encompassing, I understood, his whole carefully maintained distance, the entire architecture of his 11 years of self-imposed isolation. "Without this, without needing to actually be close to you, to mean it. I love you too," I told him, and watched something in his face transform entirely, the careful control cracking open into an expression of such raw, unguarded hope that I had to look away for a moment, overwhelmed by the privilege of being the one who put it there. "And I don't need grand gestures, Raoul. I just need you, however much of yourself you can give me, whenever you're ready to give it." "I want to give you all of it," he said. "I'm just afraid of what happens if I get it wrong." "Then we'll figure it out together, slowly, however slowly you need." He brought our joined hands up with a deliberateness that made my breath catch and pressed the lightest possible kiss against my knuckles. The contact so brief and so careful it felt like watching someone diffuse something they genuinely believed might explode. "Slowly," he agreed. "I can try slowly." That was the day everything between us changed in earnest. Not because anything dramatic happened, not because some grand barrier came crashing down all at once, but because a quiet, private door had finally opened between two people who'd both been waiting in their own different ways for permission to want something they were afraid to need. The months that followed were, without exaggeration, the gentlest education either of us had ever undertaken. Raoul approached physical closeness the way a person might approach learning to walk again after a long injury, methodically with small deliberate increments, never rushing past what felt safe, but never retreating from progress once it had been made either. We started with hands, simply existing intertwined during our evening walks, until the sensation of his palm against mine stopped registering in his nervous system as danger and started registering slowly as comfort. Then came the careful experiment of sitting close enough that our shoulders touched. An arrangement that took him 3 separate attempts and one full retreat back to his customary foot of distance before he managed to stay through an entire conversation without flinching. I never rushed him. I want that understood clearly, because I think it mattered more than anything else I did during that whole stretch of our courtship. I let him fail at closeness as many times as he needed to, without ever making the failure feel like rejection on my part. Every time he pulled back, I simply waited, present and unbothered, until he found his way back on his own terms. Trust, I was learning, isn't built in the moments of success. It's built in the moments of failure that don't get punished. By midsummer, he could hold me. Not the brief, hesitant contact of those early months, but real, sustained closeness. My back against his chest as we watched the sunset from the ridge above the lower dens, his arms wrapped fully around me. His face pressed into the curve of my neck like he was finally allowing himself the luxury he'd denied himself for over a decade. I felt him shaking, sometimes, in those early extended embraces, not from fear exactly, but from the sheer overwhelming size of an emotion he'd spent 11 years refusing to let himself feel. I learned to simply hold still during those moments, to let him ride out whatever wave had risen in him, until his breathing steadied and his arms relaxed into something that felt less like bracing and more like belonging. "I keep waiting to hurt you," he admitted once, his voice muffled against my hair, his arms loosely circling my waist while we sat together on the ridge. "Every single time. Some part of me is always waiting for the moment my hands stop being careful." "They never have," I pointed out, "not once." "I know. I'm starting to know it anyway. It's just—" He exhaled slowly, and I felt the breath move through his whole chest where it pressed against my back. "It's a hard thing to unlearn when the lesson got carved in so deep. You don't have to unlearn it all at once. You're allowed to keep being careful. I just want you to know you don't have to be afraid of me anymore." "I'm not afraid of you," he said, and there was a certainty in it that hadn't been there months before. "I think I've never been afraid of you at all. I'm only ever afraid of myself." That distinction, small as it sounds, marked something important shifting in him. The slow, gradual separation of who he actually was from who his grief had convinced him he had to become. By the time autumn arrived again, a full year after I'd first fallen into a ravine and found myself caught by an arm I'd assumed belonged to a man incapable of warmth, Raoul Logan had become someone I barely recognized from that distant, careful figure standing at the edge of every gathering. He still kept some reserve in public. Old habits, old fears don't dissolve completely even with love and patience. But in private, in the space that belonged only to the two of us, he had become unmistakably, fully present, tender in ways I don't think even he had known himself capable of. He proposed mating to me on the 1-year anniversary of that first conversation at the stone marker, choosing the same spot with a deliberateness that told me exactly how much weight he'd assigned to the symbolism. He didn't have a ring. Wolves rarely bother with such things. Our bonds marked differently through scent and mark and the deep instinctual recognition that runs beneath language. But he had practiced what he wanted to say. I could tell because the words came out smoother than his usual careful hesitance allowed. "I spent 11 years believing love was something I had to deny myself to keep other people safe," he said, kneeling, in the same snow where he'd once told me about his brother. His hands holding mine with a steadiness that would have seemed impossible to the man I'd met that first autumn. "You taught me that was never actually true, that the danger was never in loving someone. It was only ever in believing I didn't deserve to." He looked up at me, and even now, a year into knowing him, the openness in his expression still had the power to steal my breath entirely. "I want to spend whatever years I have left proving that lesson was wrong. I want to mate you, Andre. I want to build a life with you that has room in it for everything I was too afraid to want before." I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence, and the mark he left against my neck that night, careful and reverent and nothing at all like the violence he'd once feared, lived permanently inside him. Sealed a bond that felt less like a beginning and more like the natural conclusion of everything we'd already built between us. I found out I was pregnant in early winter, not quite 2 months into our mating, and I remember sitting alone in the healer's den for a long while after receiving the news, trying to absorb the particular vertigo of a life-changing shape all at once. Wolves conceive easily within a true mated bond, but knowing the biology in the abstract did nothing to prepare me for the reality of a healer placing her hand against my stomach and confirming with quiet certainty that there was a new life growing there, half mine, half Raoul's, entirely unprecedented in either of our lives. I didn't know how to tell him. That fear surprised me, given everything we'd already overcome together, but this felt different, bigger, more permanent. The kind of news that doesn't just deepen an existing bond, but fundamentally reshapes the entire architecture of two lives at once. I worried, irrationally perhaps, that the weight of impending fatherhood might trigger some retreat in him, some flare of the old fear that had kept him so carefully isolated for so many years. A child requires a different kind of physical presence than a mate does. Constant, total, the furthest possible thing from the careful, controlled distance Raoul had spent over a decade perfecting. I needn't have worried, though. The worry itself, I think, was simply the last echo of an old habit, bracing for loss even in the middle of something wonderful. A habit I suspect I'd absorbed from watching Raoul brace against his own happiness for so long. I told him that evening, in the quiet privacy of the small home we'd built together at the edge of the territory, and I watched his face move through an entire landscape of emotion in the span of a few seconds, shock first, then something that looked almost like fear, and then breaking through everything else like sunlight through storm clouds. A joy so total and unguarded that it brought tears to my own eyes just witnessing it. "A child," he said, the words coming out barely above a whisper, like he was afraid speaking too loudly might somehow undo the truth of it. "Ours." "Ours," I confirmed, watching him carefully, braced for whatever fear might follow the joy. It didn't come. Instead, he crossed the small distance between us and pulled me into an embrace, so careful and so complete that I felt for the first time the full weight of how far he'd traveled from that frightened, isolated man at the edge of the training grounds. His hand came to rest against my stomach light as a held breath, and I felt him trembling. Not with fear this time, I understood instinctively, but with the overwhelming enormity of a love that had finally found somewhere new to grow. "I'm going to be terrified the entire time," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I won't pretend otherwise. Every single day until this baby is born safely, some part of me is going to be afraid. I know. But I'm not going to let that fear win anymore. Not with you, not with our child." He pulled back just enough to look at me, his eyes bright with unshed tears he didn't bother hiding. "I spent 11 years thinking my love was a danger to the people I cared about most. I'm not raising a child who grows up believing that same lie about himself or about me. Whatever this fear costs me, I'll pay it. I won't let it cost our family the closeness I almost let it steal from us." I believed him completely in that moment, and the months that followed only deepened that belief with every passing week. Pregnancy among wolves moves faster than it does for ordinary humans, a matter of months rather than the better part of a year. But even compressed, those months carried their own particular weight, and I found myself, by the depths of winter, large and slow, and increasingly aware of how visibly our private life had become a public one. There's no hiding a pregnant omega in a pack this size, and there's certainly no hiding one mated to an alpha as singularly known for his isolation as Raoul Logan. The whole pack watched our transformation with an interest that bordered on collective disbelief, the kind of attention usually reserved for events too unlikely to have been predicted by anyone. I didn't mind the attention mostly. What I minded, in the quiet moments when I let myself think about it honestly, was the way Raoul still kept careful boundaries in public even as our private life had become so completely, joyfully physical. He held me without hesitation in our home, pressed kisses against my growing stomach every night before sleep, slept with his hand resting protectively over the place where our child grew, as natural now as breathing. But the moment we stepped beyond our own door into the company of the wider pack, some old reflex reasserted itself, a careful, practiced distance that kept his hands at his sides and his expression composed into the same controlled neutrality he'd worn for the 11 years before I knew him. I understood it, even as it quietly ached. Public closeness meant witnesses. Witnesses meant the possibility of failure made visible, made permanent in the collective memory of an entire pack that had spent over a decade believing Raoul Logan simply wasn't capable of casual physical affection. I think some part of him still believed that performing closeness in front of others risked something private being cheapened, or worse, risked some old fear resurfacing under the pressure of an audience. So I waited, the way I'd learned to wait for everything with him, trusting that whatever pace he needed would eventually bring us to the place we both wanted to be. The moment came, in the end, not because either of us planned it, but because fear has a way of stripping away pretense faster than any deliberate decision ever could. It happened during the winter gathering, the largest communal event of the pack's calendar, when every den and every family came together in the central courtyard for a celebration that stretched from afternoon into deep night. I was 8 months along by then, heavy and tired in the particular way that made even standing for long stretches a genuine effort, and Raoul had insisted, with the protective fussing that had become endearingly familiar over the preceding months, that I sit through most of the gathering rather than stand among the crowd. I was sitting on a bench near the edge of the courtyard, watching the festivities with the contentment of someone who'd finally found exactly where she belonged when the pain hit. It wasn't like anything I'd felt before, not the dull ache of an overworked back or the familiar pull of stretched muscle that had become routine over the last weeks, but something sharper, more urgent, radiating outward from low in my stomach with an intensity that stole the breath clean out of my lungs. I gasped, doubling forward slightly, one hand flying instinctively to my belly, and the sound must have carried further than I expected, because within seconds Raoul was beside me, having crossed what must have been 30 feet of crowded courtyard faster than I'd ever seen him move. "Andre." His voice had none of its usual careful control. It was sharp with a fear so raw it cut through every layer of composure he'd built over the years. "Andre, what's wrong? Talk to me." "It hurts," I managed, the pain rolling through me in another wave, sharper than the first. "Raoul, something's wrong, it's too early." I watched the fear in his face transform into something I'd never witnessed in him before. Not the careful, contained anxiety he'd shown in smaller moments, but a full, unguarded terror that stripped away every instinct toward composure he'd ever cultivated. And in that moment, with 300 members of our pack, watching with the entire careful architecture of his public reserve hanging in the balance, Raoul Logan did the thing I'd quietly, hopefully waited a year and a half to see him do. He took my hand, not carefully, not with the measured, deliberate hesitance that had defined every moment of physical affection he'd ever shown me in private, weighing each touch like it might still somehow prove dangerous. He simply reached out and gripped my hand like a man grabbing the only solid thing in a world suddenly spinning out from under him, his fingers lacing through mine with a desperate, total firmness that had nothing held back in it at all. "I've got you," he said. The same words he'd spoken in that ravine 18 months before, except this time his voice cracked open around them, raw with a fear he made no attempt to hide from anyone watching. "I've got you. I'm right here. I'm not letting go." The courtyard had gone quiet around us. I registered it dimly through the haze of pain and fear, the way 300 conversations seemed to die at once, the way every face in that crowd turned toward the sight of their alpha. The man who hadn't touched another living soul in public for over a decade, who'd built an entire reputation around the careful, untouchable distance he kept from everyone, gripping his pregnant mate's hand in front of the whole pack like nothing in the world could have made him let go. He didn't seem to notice the silence at all. His entire attention had narrowed down to me, to the pain crossing my face, to the urgent need to get me to the healers before whatever was happening could worsen. He scooped me up entirely careful of my belly, but utterly without his old hesitance, and carried me across the courtyard with the same swift, sure strength he'd once used to catch me falling into a ravine. Except now, there was nothing held back in it, nothing careful or controlled or distant. Just love, plain and total, and finally, fully unafraid. The healers determined after several of the longest hours of my entire life that it was false labor, early frightening but not actually dangerous, a common enough occurrence in the final stretch of pregnancy that the senior healer assured us both repeatedly that everything remained perfectly healthy. I remember the wave of relief that crossed Raoul's face when she delivered that news so total it nearly buckled his knees, and I remember even more clearly that he didn't let go of my hand once during the entire ordeal, not while the healers examined me, not while we waited for results, not even afterward walking back through the now quiet courtyard toward our home. His fingers still laced through mine with the same fierce, unhesitating grip he'd found in the worst moment of fear either of us had felt since the fever that nearly took me the year before. "You held my hand," I said quietly, once we were home, once the adrenaline had finally begun to drain from both of us, leaving only the bone-deep exhaustion of fear survived. In front of everyone. I know. He sat beside me on our bed, still holding my hand, looking down at our joined fingers like he was seeing something genuinely new. I didn't even think about it. I just knew I needed you to know I wasn't going anywhere, and there wasn't time to be careful about how I said it. "Does it scare you that everyone saw?" He considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything, turning it over with the same careful deliberation he brought to every aspect of his life. "A year ago, it would have terrified me," he admitted. "I think some part of me always believed that if I let people see how much I needed you, how much I loved you, it would somehow prove I'd never really had control of myself at all, that the careful distance was the only thing keeping everyone safe from whatever happened to Tomas." He looked up at me, and the openness in his expression had a settled quality to it now, none of the old fragility I remembered from our earliest conversations. "But today, watching you in pain, the only thing I could think about was getting to you, holding on to you. I didn't have room left for fear of my own strength. There was only room for you." "I'm glad," I said softly. "I've wanted that for so long, not because I needed proof, Raoul. I always believed you loved me. I just wanted the rest of the pack to see what I already knew, that you're not the careful, untouchable alpha they think you are. You're someone capable of so much tenderness, it just took the right moment to let everyone else see it too." "They've been talking about it all evening, apparently," he said, a small, almost disbelieving smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Senna told me half the courtyard didn't know what to do with themselves. Apparently I've ruined 11 years of careful reputation in about 30 seconds. "Good," I said, laughing despite the lingering exhaustion. "It was a terrible reputation anyway. I much prefer this version of you." "So do I," he admitted quietly, bringing our joined hands up to press a kiss against my knuckles, the same gesture he'd offered that first morning after the fever broke. Except now, there was nothing careful or hesitant left in it at all. Only a year and a half of accumulated trust finally allowed to exist in the open. I think I've preferred this version of myself for a long time. I just needed you to help me find him. The pack talked about it for weeks afterward, exactly as Senna had predicted, though the conversations shifted gradually from disbelief into something warmer, a kind of quiet, collective relief, I think, on behalf of an alpha they'd long admired but never quite managed to feel close to. People began greeting Raoul differently after that night, I noticed. Small gestures, mostly. A hand briefly on his shoulder during a greeting that he no longer flinched away from, an easier warmth in the way betas and omegas alike spoke to him during pack gatherings. As though the version of him revealed in that single unguarded moment had given everyone silent permission to expect more closeness from him than they'd previously dared to hope for. He didn't become a different person overnight. I want to be honest about that, too, because I think it matters more than any tidy resolution would. Raoul still carried traces of the old caution in him, small habits that surfaced occasionally, even in the months that followed. A brief hesitation before embracing someone new. A flicker of old fear crossing his face during moments of high stress. the lingering echo of 11 years spent believing his own hands were something to fear. But the difference, the real and lasting difference, was that he no longer let that fear make his decisions for him. He'd touch me in front of the whole pack without a second thought. Now, rest a hand against my belly during gatherings. Lace his fingers through mine while we walked the same perimeter trails where this whole story had quietly begun. The old reflex toward distance had loosened its grip on him. Not vanished entirely, but no longer powerful enough to override the love that had grown stronger than the grief underneath it. Our daughter was born in early spring, 3 weeks after that frightening false labor, in a birth that the healers later described, with evident relief, as entirely uncomplicated. I won't pretend the labor itself was easy. Nothing about bringing new life into the world ever is, regardless of species or circumstance. But I remember, even through the haze of pain and exertion, the constant, steady presence of Raoul beside me, his hand gripping mine through every contraction with a strength that never once wavered, never once pulled back, not for a single second of the entire ordeal. We named her Tamsin, a name that belonged to no one in either of our families, chosen deliberately as something entirely her own, a future unburdened by the weight of grief that had shaped so much of her father's past. The first time Raoul held her in the quiet hour just after her birth, I watched him with the same careful attention I'd once paid to watching him hold himself at a careful distance from the rest of the world. And I saw in the way he cradled her against his chest an entire decade and a half of restrained love finally given somewhere safe to land. "She's so small," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he made no effort to hide, his thumb tracing, with infinite gentleness, the curve of her tiny hand where it had wrapped instinctively around his finger. I keep thinking about how careful I need to be. And then I keep thinking about how that fear almost cost me everything good in my life. And I don't want to teach her that fear too. I don't want her growing up watching her father hold back from the people he loves. She won't, I told him, watching the two of them together, this fierce, gentle man, and the tiny new life he'd helped create, and feeling something settle fully into place in my chest. A happiness so complete it felt almost like its own kind of grief. The bittersweet ache of getting exactly what you'd once been afraid to hope for. She's going to grow up knowing exactly how much her father loves her. Loudly, without any hesitation at all. He looked up at me then, his eyes bright with unshed tears, and I saw on his face the full distance he'd traveled. From that careful, isolated figure standing at the edge of the training grounds. The autumn I first arrived to this, a father holding his newborn daughter with the same fearless devotion he'd shown holding my hand in front of the whole pack. Finally and fully unafraid of his own capacity to love. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for waiting, for not giving up on me, even when I made it difficult." "You were never difficult," I told him, settling closer against his side, our daughter sleeping peacefully between us. "You were just healing. There's a difference." We sat together like that for a long while, the three of us, while the spring light moved slowly across the room and the rest of the pack waited outside, eager for their first glimpse of the alpha's new daughter. The proof of a love story that had quietly reshaped how an entire community understood the man who led them. I thought, in that quiet hour, about the version of Raoul I'd first seen across the training grounds, carved out of mountain stone, untouchable, and alone. I thought about the version of him I'd come to know instead. Patient and careful and capable of a tenderness so deep it had simply needed the right person, the right amount of time, to finally be allowed to surface. I thought, too, about that single moment in the courtyard, his hand gripping mine in front of 300 witnesses. The moment that had apparently undone over a decade of careful reputation in less time than it takes to draw a breath. People still mention it, sometimes even now, months later. The day the Logan Alpha, who'd never touched anyone in all the years anyone could remember, held his pregnant mate's hand in front of the whole pack like the rest of the world had simply ceased to exist. I understand why it became the story people tell. It has the shape of all the best stories, a single, dramatic moment that seems to explain everything, a turning point clean enough to hang a whole narrative on. but I know the truth was always slower and quieter than that single moment suggests. The hand-holding wasn't the beginning of his healing. It was simply the moment everyone else finally got to see what I'd already known for over a year. That underneath all that careful, practiced distance, Raul Logan had never stopped being capable of love. He'd just been waiting, same as the rest of us, for someone patient enough to prove it was safe to let it show. Tamsin is older now, old enough to climb into her father's lap unprompted, old enough to demand his attention with the easy, fearless confidence of a child who has never once doubted how deeply she's loved. I watch them together sometimes in the quiet hours after the PAX evening gatherings. Raul's arms wrapped fully and unhesitatingly around our daughter while she chatters about whatever small adventure occupied her day. And I think about how far we've both traveled from where we started. Him from a man convinced his own strength was a danger to everyone he loved, me from a quiet, curious Omega who fell into a ravine and found instead of injury the beginning of everything that mattered most in my life. People still ask me, sometimes, what changed him. They want the simple version, the story that fits neatly into a single dramatic scene. I tell them the truth instead, even though it's less tidy. Nothing changed him, not really. He was always this person, underneath the grief and the fear and the careful armor he'd built to keep himself from hurting anyone the way he believed he'd hurt his brother. All that ever happened, in the end, was that he finally let himself be seen. And I will spend the rest of my life grateful that I was the one patient enough and lucky enough to be standing close enough to watch it happen. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe. Comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.